During the years following World War II, they went out to the light, horrifying findings that revealed the true extent of the Nazi horror. Deep in a former psychiatric hospital, discovered that hundreds of patients were killed under programs of euthanasia disguised as medical treatments, without noise, without gunshots, only injections, hunger, and abandonment. Further away, a school, the Secret SS, trained young people in the art of killing, training them with brutal methods to turn them into unscrupulous executioners. In Berlin, the colossal anti-aircraft towers, concrete bunkers almost indestructible, rose as defensive fortresses, but also as command centers, where crucial information and weapons were hidden experimental. In another corner of the Reich, the facilities were found Lebensborn, where selected women were forced to give birth for the regime, robbing their children if they did not live up to the ideal racial. And underground, a gigantic factory and an unfinished bunker, they revealed the unfinished dream of a limitless war machine. Issue 21. The Remnants of German Fear. In 1940, the Germans took control of the Channel Islands, a small group of British territories located off the coast of France. It was the only part of the United Kingdom that remained in Nazi hands during the conflict. They soon began fortifying it. Guernsey, Jersey, and Alderney were filled with defensive constructions. They built bunkers, observation points, heavy weapons outposts, tunnels, warehouses, and underground shelters. All part of the so-called Atlantic Wall, a line of defense they erected to prevent invasion from the sea. For these constructions, they employed prisoners and forced labor. They dug with basic tools without protective equipment and during exhausting days. The treatment was extreme. On Alderney, they even built forced labor camps. The shelters were made of solid, very thick concrete, often hidden among rock formations or buried underground. Some had ventilation, command rooms, spaces for storing missiles, and passages that linked them to other defenses. From these points, the beaches, heights, and strategic roads were monitored. The islands continued to be reinforced until the final days of the war. The weaker Germany became, the more structures they added, but after the liberation of France, the islands were cut off. There was no heavy fighting in that area. The surrender came in May 1945. At the end of the war, many of these shelters were rendered unusable. Some were buried or converted into warehouses, others remained as they were and can still be visited today. There are areas where the original structures can still be seen. The Channel Islands clearly show how the regime prepared for a possible enemy landing. The defenses reflect the scale of the effort, even though they were never actually used in combat. Today, many of these structures remain part of the environment. Some are still underground. Several have been restored. They function as memorial centers or historical sites. Although the fire didn't reach these islands, their structures bear witness to another aspect of the conflict, the constant fear of an invasion that never happened. Number 20. The barrels of gas that continue to float under the Baltic. When the war ended, the Allies didn't want to keep the gas reserves they had found in German hands. They decided to get rid of everything quickly. The most practical option was to ship it to the Baltic Sea and dump it. There were no detailed plans or protocols. They used cargo ships and filled them with metal barrels. Inside were mustard gas, lewisite, and mixtures that had been manufactured for use in an emergency. The dumping took place off the coasts of Germany, Denmark, Poland, Sweden, and Latvia. No exact maps were drawn up. They were dumped in areas marked with coordinates that were not always preserved. The barrels, some made of steel and others of thinner materials, were thrown without any additional protection straight to the bottom. Years later, the first warnings began. Fishermen working in nearby waters pulled in stained nets. Sometimes they found parts of rusted structures or traces of liquid that left burns on their skin. In some cases, they lost their sight or suffered strange infections. The authorities offered no clear answers. Eventually, some diving teams went down with cameras. They found rusty barrels, many deformed, some open. Several had labels in German. In nearby areas, there were no fish. The ground was covered in thick mud and bubbles rose from specific places. The mustard gas, when mixed with salt water, formed a dense, sticky, and still active substance. On contact with the skin, it caused blisters. At the bottom of the sea, it remained stable, but when it rose to the surface, it caused severe reactions. From this emerged projects like ChemSea, where scientific teams from different countries mapped landfills, took samples, and marked areas as hazardous. Some stretches of the sea were declared Dead zones. There was no marine life or vegetation. Despite the evidence, governments failed to agree on action. The cost of extracting or neutralizing the waste was very high. No one wanted to take it on. Some countries didn't even acknowledge that they knew how many barrels they had dumped. Today, in several Baltic ports, fishing boats continue to avoid certain routes. If they pull up anything suspicious, they cut the net and release it into the water. There are chemical monitoring stations, but they operate with few staff and are not always active. Number 19. The Secret Lair, locked up for over 800 days. In a forest in eastern Poland, one of the most tightly controlled areas of the Third Reich was built. Hitler's headquarters for directing the war on the Soviet front was located there. It was known as the Wolf's Lair. To enter, one had to pass through covert filters, hidden checkpoints, and paths lined with fences. It wasn't an isolated building. The area was made up of many facilities. There were offices, dormitories, generators, radio centers, and shelters. The roofs were covered with branches and tarps so that nothing could be seen from above. Some walls were concrete blocks thick enough to withstand explosives. From that point, Hitler managed key operations against the USSR. He spent more than 800 days there, most of them locked in his private shelter. He received papers, issued orders, and made decisions without leaving. Technicians placed explosives in various places. If the enemy arrived, they could blow everything up in a short time. Escape routes were also created underneath. Some of those tunnels were never found. This was also where the attack of July 20th, 1944 took place. Klaus von Stauffenberg left a bomb at a meeting. The explosion caused several injuries, but Hitler survived. After that, surveillance increased. Access points were closed and new barriers were installed. The base had 3 levels. The first was for soldiers and guards, the second for technicians and office staff. The third was used only by Hitler and his closest circle. When everything was lost in 1945, they tried to render it unusable. They placed charges at key points. Even so, a large part remained undestroyed. Today, huge fragments still lie in the same place. For decades, no one seriously investigated. Only after the fall of the communist bloc did excavations begin. Rusted cables, broken foundations, metal doors, and forgotten objects were found. Today, the site remains empty. You can walk among broken walls, sealed tunnels, and unmarked structures. The map is incomplete. Many corridors end at dead ends. People who go there say that the most striking thing is the general feeling. There are no signs or information, just hollow buildings built to wage war with nothing visible from the outside. Issue 18, the nameless room of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, bodies in display cases. In a wooded area north of Munich, near Lake Starnberg, a cement structure was set up under a tin roof, isolated among trees. It had no windows, just a back door and a front door with a double lock. Inside, during the years of the regime, they set up a physical observation center where they imprisoned people brought from African colonies or prison camps. They were measured, weighed naked, and forced to stand still so they could be drawn or photographed from different angles. Everything was recorded in numbered notebooks signed by SS doctors. Some days they were shown to students or party visitors. They were placed behind a glass case in a glass room with a bench inside without shelter or food. The floor was cold cement. The lights were left on all day. Next to that room was an office with filing cabinets, a large scale, flasks of liquids, and a table where personal belongings were left. Those brought in weren't told how long they would be there. They slept on thin mats. They were given food once per shift, only bread, water, and canned soup. Clothing changes were made every 4 or 5 days. Sometimes they were made to stand for hours without moving while their reactions were recorded. If they fell, they were picked up and put back down. They didn't speak to anyone. Those working there wore white uniforms and gloves. They came in, did their part, and left without saying a word. The on-site documents spoke of physiological observation. There were sheets full of skull measurements, hair markings, nose proportions, and distances between fingers. Everything was recorded with rulers, compasses, and wooden molds. Sometimes they were shaved and scalp samples were taken for analysis elsewhere. They had a bright lamp pointed directly at their faces. They opened their mouths with metal tools, took notes, and took photographs. At the end of the corridor, there was a room with test tubes and old cameras mounted on iron tripods. Each image was labeled with a number, no name, just a date and code. The bodies were treated like catalogue items. On the busiest days, buses arrived with new groups. They got off quickly, entered without asking, and had everything taken from them. Those who left the glass-fronted room were taken to a darker room. There they underwent X-rays and urine tests and were left strapped to a gurney while machines were passed over them. Some days the same steps were repeated. They made them bend over, stretch, twist their necks, and raise their arms. The notes included technical terms that only Reich doctors used. Many sheets bore the seal of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. The papers went directly to Berlin, packed in envelopes with string and shellac seals. In another room, further back, they kept body parts in jars. There were ears floating in liquid, loose teeth, fragments of skin and fingernails. Everything was numbered. On a shelf was an entire torso preserved in formalin. Some of the names written on the containers were the same as those on the entry records. Bodies that were no longer useful were carried by 2 guards wrapped in blankets and put into an unmarked van that left the premises. No one asked where they were going. No one ever saw them again. The workers there didn't sleep there. They entered in shifts. They always used the same route. They didn't speak to each other. There was a guard who took attendance and marked with chalk on the door how many were entering and how many were leaving. Those who showed signs of illness were isolated in a windowless room. They were left there until their bodies stopped responding. Then one of the doctors would appear and sign a 3-lined form. This form was kept in an envelope with no return address. As the end of the war drew near, they began to remove things. First the jars, then the boxes of folders, then the cameras. The display cases were dismantled. Some of the materials were burned in the nearby forest. Others were buried in a ditch behind the building. In the last few days, engines could be heard all night. They even took away the light fixtures on the ceiling. They left only the concrete, the broken doors, and a few dangling wires. When the Allies passed through the area, they entered the place. They found stains on the walls, marks of masking tape on the floor, and labels fallen into the dust. In one corner, there was a child's shoe and a box of loose papers. Some read Individual 214 or Subject without reference. There were no signs, no names remained, only empty rooms with rusty doors and low ceilings where light no longer penetrated. The building was boarded up for years. No one wanted to use it for anything. Then it was demolished without warning. The land now has new trees and a low fence. No one has any idea what was there. But in some archives of the old Anthropology Institute, there are still records of those bodies that once lived locked behind glass without knowing why. Number 17. Berlin's air raid towers. In the final months of the conflict, Berlin was a constant target of Allied air raids. To try to defend the city from above, the regime ordered the construction of giant defense towers known as flak towers. They were enormous blocks of solid concrete made to withstand direct blasts and support heavy cannons installed above. Each one was divided into several levels. The topmost area housed anti-aircraft guns. The middle floors contained control rooms, rooms with technical equipment, and areas for radar operators. The lower floors served as shelters for thousands of people during the bombing raids. Tiergarten, Humboldthain, and Friedrichshain neighborhoods. Some reached over 40 meters. From their terraces, shots were coordinated against enemy aircraft. Inside, everything was organized down to the last detail. There were emergency exits, water tanks, their own generators, and rooms for caring for the wounded. The internal walls were very thick and had no windows. Despite the noise and stress, the teams continued working for hours to ensure nothing came to a standstill. In the worst attacks, thousands of people entered these towers seeking protection. Although they were intended as defensive points, they also ended up being the last safe place for many. They withstood direct hits without collapsing. When the Soviet army arrived in the capital, some were partially blown up, others remained as they were. Because they were so large and sturdy, demolishing them was not easy. In the years that followed, some were covered with earth, others were transformed into public spaces. Today, several of these flak towers still exist. Some are observation decks, others function as parks or are closed to access. Their walls still bear the marks of what happened. Pieces of shrapnel embedded in them, cracks from the explosions, and remains of exploded concrete. Berlin's flak towers were an attempt to defend the city from the sky with gigantic structures and heavy weapons. They didn't change the outcome, but they were active until the last days. Number 16. The submarine. U-864 was sent as a last resort to deliver strategic materials to the Japanese. It was a 73-meter submarine carrying nearly 2,000 containers filled with liquid mercury. It left Bergen, Norway, in February 1917. 45, heading for the Pacific via South America. The mission was maintained in complete radio silence, but the British were already on top. Their code talkers intercepted the signal and redirected it to HMS Ventura, an Allied submarine. In that underwater encounter, something happened that had never been done before: a submarine battle between two submarines. Captain Lunders calculated 4 possible trajectories and launched the torpedoes one after the other. 14 minutes later, U-864 broke in two and sank at a depth of over 150 meters near Fedja. Over time, the cargo's metal capsules began to rust. The mercury began to seep into the seabed. Analysis by Norwegian scientists showed dangerous levels of the metal in fish like cod and crustaceans like crabs. Authorities banned fishing in the area. Various courses of action were discussed. Some wanted to cut open the hull and remove it piece by piece, but that could release more poison. Others proposed leaving it where it was and sealing it completely. In the end, it was decided to cover it with a concrete and gravel structure. The entire process was scheduled for completion in 2026. Today, environmental teams continue to monitor the area. Contamination levels remain high. That cargo, which crossed half the world during the war, continues to leak into the ocean every day. No bomb exploded there, but the damage remained floating underwater, mixed with metal debris, the crew's bones, and the ever-rising poison. Number 15. The Cradles of Stolen Purity. During the regime's years, one of the most twisted ideas took shape through a plan that blended motherhood, control, and racial purity. The Lebensborn program was created to protect mothers the regime considered valuable, those who could bring into the world children with the characteristics they wanted to multiply: blondes, light eyes, perfect health. But behind it all lay something much darker. Special homes were opened in different parts of Germany and in the occupied countries. In these places, women gave birth under controlled conditions and often had no idea what would happen to their children. Some were told the babies were adopted by party families. Others had their children taken away from them outright without explanation. In some cases, the children came from elsewhere, children kidnapped from invaded countries who seemed German enough to be re-educated. When the war ended, many of these homes were abandoned. The files were burned, the names erased, and thousands of these children grew up without knowing where they came from. In the following years, clues began to be found. Forged certificates, incomplete lists, letters hidden in closets. Some surviving women recounted how they were forced to give up their children. Other accounts spoke of children taken far away and raised under different names, as if their past didn't exist. Today, in some of these houses, you can still see remnants of the past. There are rooms with small beds, long hallways with numbered doors, and drawings on the walls made by children's hands. In certain places, discrete exhibitions have been set up featuring salvaged objects and fragments of testimonies, but much of the program remains a black hole. Many of those who participated remained silent, and those who sought answers were met with silence, closed files, and broken memories. That program, presented as a means of aid to single mothers, was in fact a machine of control where the value of a life was measured by eye color or the shape of a skull. And its traces, though blurred, continue to appear from time to time like loose pieces of a story that never quite ended. Issue 14. The Hidden Factory That Swallowed Bodies. By 1944, Allied bombing was already leveling German factories faster than they could rebuild. To continue producing weapons, the Nazis took everything underground. In the Harz Mountains, they forced prisoners taken from Buchenwald to dig more than 20 kilometers of tunnels. They were given oil lanterns and heavy tools and had them break rock for hours without a break. There they laid rails, installed giant presses, set up electrical systems, and began manufacturing parts. They produced everything from cannons and tank parts to the fuselages of the new Messerschmitt 262 jet aircraft. The dust in the tunnels left people coughing blood. The walls sometimes gave way, swallowing entire groups. The air was thick. The lights went out without warning. There were no windows or quick exits. If it collapsed, no one got out. To make them work harder, the guards gave them food only if they met quotas. If they didn't reach the number of pieces, they didn't eat. Every week, bodies were taken out and new ones brought in. Everything was replaced like parts in a chain. When the Americans arrived in April 1945, they found machines, crates of rockets, discarded tools, and thousands of bodies piled up among the half-finished production. Army engineers inspected the area and destroyed what remained of the live explosives. To this day, buried ordnance still turns up every time it rains heavily or someone digs. The main tunnels were sealed with concrete, but inside there remains toxic dust, rusty debris, and unexploded dynamite. Nothing was left working, but the tunnels are still there. They're like a forgotten warehouse filled with parts, skeletons, and machinery that never made it to the front. Number 13. The island where the space race began. On an island in the Baltic Sea, north of Germany, the Nazis set up the most advanced testing center of its time. Peenemünde wasn't just a military site, it was a factory, a laboratory, a training camp, and a firing range, all at the same time. From there, the first rockets to leave the atmosphere were launched, as well as the most dangerous weapons of the war, the V-1 and V-2. The facilities occupied almost the entire island. There were hangars, launch pads, reinforced bunkers, and barracks where the technicians lived. Many of them were young engineers led by Werner von Braun. Every day, engines were tested, speeds were measured, errors were corrected, and reports were sent to the High Command. Every time a rocket failed, it was analyzed down to the last nut and bolt. Every time one worked, preparations were made for mass production. The V-1 was an unmanned aircraft with a pulse engine launched from a ramp and flying straight until it exploded. The V-2 was something else. It was a vertical missile rising into the sky and falling silently. It made no noise upon arrival, it just exploded. London was the first target, but others followed. Each impact left deaths, debris, and terror. The Allies were slow to discover the site. When they did, they sent bombers in a massive operation. They destroyed part of the complex, but not all. Some structures were reinforced with thicker concrete and continued to function. As the war progressed, testing was moved to more remote areas. Peenemünde remained a symbol of something that blended science with destruction. After the end of the conflict, many of the brains behind the project were captured by the Americans and taken to the United States under a secret program. From there, they helped launch satellites and prepare space missions. But it all began on that island, with plans drawn up under surveillance, engines running in the early morning, and missiles aimed across the sea. Issue 12. The Buried Gestapo Documents in Prague. In the heart of Prague, right next to Wenceslas Square, stands a dark stone building that served as a bank for decades. But from 1939 until the end of the war, it was controlled by the Gestapo. There they interrogated, beat, and eliminated anyone who even smelled of resistance. Czechs who entered that building went down a windowless corridor, passed through a reinforced door, and spent hours not knowing if they would come out alive. Then communism covered everything up. No one asked what happened in those basements. The building changed its name, owner, and facade. Inscriptions were covered up, rooms were sealed, and filing cabinets were placed where screams had once been. 40 years later, when the communist regime fell, they began to search public buildings to clear away the remnants of the past. That's how a group of workers entered one of the offices next to the old interrogation area. They tore down a false partition, and behind them they found a door locked with rusty padlocks. They forced it open. What lay on the other side wasn't dust or debris. It was a room filled to the ceiling with metal filing cabinets. There were documents dated 1940, sheets signed with the names of Nazi officials, entire folders labeled with addresses, lists, photos, surveillance maps, and execution forms. Some sheets bore traces of blood, others bore handwritten censorship marks. They were complete records of the inner workings of the Gestapo in the city: arrest routes, torture reports, deportation records, informer files, and forms with orders for transfer to concentration camps. There were also letters that never reached their destination, testimonies written by prisoners before they were executed, and photo albums showing officers posing with handcuffed detainees or with corpses in backyards. Among the boxes were tapes, recordings in German and Czech, many unclassified. No one had listened to them in more than 4 decades. The most shocking thing wasn't just the contents, but the order. Everything was packed and sorted by date and number. Someone had hidden it without wanting to destroy it. The seals were intact. Much of this evidence had never been used in any trial. Some victims appeared for the first time with full names. Others, believed to have died in camps, were listed as having been shot in basements of that same building. There were medical records proving experiments on detainees with diseases. There were reports about university professors who were tortured and then buried in the woods, and there were anonymous letters that denounced entire families for listening to foreign radio or hiding a Jew in the attic. Hundreds of these sheets had the same signatures at the end, the officers who later vanished into Germany or Austria without answering to any court. When the room was opened, everything was moved in armored boxes to the State Archive. Historians, translators, and digital technicians worked there for years. Thousands of sheets were scanned. Many of them served to initiate legal proceedings against Czech collaborators who were still alive. Others helped identify human remains found in unmarked mass graves. Some recordings shed light on forgotten cases. And several relatives of the disappeared received for the first time a concrete explanation. The reports, the dates, the photos, everything matched. It wasn't an archive story. It was a scene that had been locked away beneath public offices, waiting for a wall to fall. Today, this material is part of the Czech Terror archives. It's not on open display. Access is by appointment only. But the contents are no longer hidden. There are online copies, translated sections, and declassified documents circulating between universities and memorial centers. There are still tapes to be reviewed and folders unopened. No one knows if there are more rooms like this in other buildings, with closed doors and full shelves waiting for someone to ask again about what was never meant to be explained. But this time in Prague, a poorly placed wall ended up exposing the exact bureaucracy of terror. Number 11. The art gallery that was almost blown up with dynamite. In a small town in the Austrian Alps near Lake Altaussee, there is a salt mine that had been in use for centuries. During the war, the Nazis turned it into one of Europe's most important hiding places. They stored thousands of works of art stolen from museums, churches, and private homes there. Paintings, statues, tapestries, manuscripts, anything of value that could fit in a wagon ended up going down the cold tunnels of that mountain. The galleries were long, dark, and constantly damp. Lights, armored doors, artificial ventilation, and platforms for storing pieces were installed. Some were wrapped in blankets. Others remained in their gilded frames. Amidst this orderly chaos, names like Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Michelangelo appeared. There were also pieces that Hitler had personally selected for the museum he planned to build in Linz. Each object had its label, its origin, and its planned destiny. When the front began to collapse, fear that the Allies would take the mine led fanatical officers to propose blowing it up with explosives. They wanted to destroy everything before that it would fall into foreign hands. Local miners found out. Some risked their lives going in at night to remove the bombs. Others secretly sent messages to the resistance. In the end, when American troops arrived, they found unexploded dynamite, barrels filled with flammable oil, and an entire gallery with walls marked for collapse. The works were there, some broken, others in perfect condition. Soldiers and art experts spent weeks packing, cataloguing, and recovering what they could. It took entire truckloads to get everything out. Years later, missing pieces were still turning up, having been moved or hidden away. Today, the mine is still operating. Some passages were closed, others were left as museums, and there are still areas where it is believed that buried works may remain, waiting to be found behind bricked-up doors or stone-sealed passageways. Number 10. The bomb they tried to light under a church. In a small town in southern Germany called Haigerloch, surrounded by hills and old houses, the Nazi regime mounted one of its most ambitious underground projects. Inside a cave dug just beneath a church, they installed an experimental nuclear reactor. They did so hastily and secretly as the war was already in its final months and the bombs fell ever closer. Access was via a steep slope, protected by a heavy door. Inside, a team of physicists worked under direct orders from the High Command. The project was led by scientists like Werner Heisenberg, who were trying to achieve a controlled nuclear reaction before the Allies succeeded. The main hall was small but filled with cables, cylinders, heavy water, and metal structures holding blocks of uranium. They arranged the pieces in a grid. Each block was submerged in containers and connected to the central system. They tried to measure emissions, observe changes, and record any signs of a sustained reaction. But the energy wasn't enough. The configuration wasn't reaching the critical point. They adjusted measurements. They reorganized the setup. They continued testing. Meanwhile, the Americans were already tracking the progress of this program. In April 1945, a special unit entered the town and took control of the facility without firing a shot. They found the reactor intact with all its components in place. They disassembled it piece by piece, loaded it onto trucks and sent it for study. The radioactive material was removed, the documents were confiscated, and the scientists were interrogated. The project never came to fruition, but it was proof that Germany was closer to achieving nuclear technology than previously thought. Today, the site of that experiment remains open to the public. The space is intact, with replicas of the reactor, explanatory panels, and markings on the wall where the original supports were. At first glance, it looks like just another cave. But at the time, it was the center of a plan that, had it worked, would have changed everything. Number 9. The store where they sold other people's stuff. In the heart of Frankfurt, during the harshest years of the regime, a system of massive theft was organized that left nothing to chance. These weren't improvised looting incidents. It was an orderly program backed by documents aimed at confiscating all the personal belongings of the city's Jews. From jewelry to silverware, from mattresses to photo albums. Everything of value or that could be reused was collected, packed and sent to large warehouses under official control. The houses were emptied by trained teams. They went room by room. They recorded what they found. They weighed it. They labeled it. Then they put it in boxes with serial numbers. The most valuable items went to party offices or were redistributed among SS members. The rest was stored in warehouses with endless shelves, where the objects were stacked like old merchandise. One of the main warehouses was on Gross Street. Friedberger hundreds of pieces of furniture, musical instruments, portraits, tools, and clocks arrived there. The employees, whether recruited civilians or forced prisoners, received precise orders to sort, clean, and prepare shipments. Sometimes the packages went to Berlin, other times they went to houses occupied by high-ranking officials. The origin didn't matter, only the intended use. When the Allies took Frankfurt, they found those warehouses intact. What they saw wasn't a museum. It was a frozen snapshot of the looting, desks covered in personal documents, drawers with wedding rings, suitcases with baby clothes. Every object had an owner, but no object had a name. The soldiers photographed the place before touching it. Then they began to identify pieces, although many had already been moved so many times that it was impossible to trace their origin. Some objects ended up in archives, others were returned with luck, but most remained as evidence of the most systematic system of theft ever to take place in a modern city. Number 8. The birthday house at the summit. At an altitude of over 1,800 meters high on a mountain in southeastern Germany, one of the regime's most striking buildings was built. The Kehlstein House, known as the Eagle's Nest, was a massive stone house perched on the edge of a precipice with views for miles around. It was a gift from the party to Hitler for his 50th birthday, although he only visited it a few times. To get there, visitors took a road carved into the rock, a feat of engineering that wound its way up through hairpin bends, short tunnels, and vertical walls. At the end of the journey, a golden elevator took visitors directly to the main hall. Everything was designed to impress. Enormous fireplaces, high ceilings, dark wood, red marble imported from Italy, and giant windows overlooking the valley. Although it had a fortress-like feel, the place wasn't a barracks. It was used more as a spot for social gatherings, lunches, receptions, and discreet get-togethers. Official photos were taken there, expensive wines were served, and people wandered around the terrace with binoculars. Many visitors left saying it was like being on top of the world. When the war ended, the Allied troops found the place almost intact. Some pieces had been looted by the last soldiers to flee. Others were still in place. The walls still had paintings. The dining table was still set. There were no secret documents or military plans, only the traces of those who had used it as a temporary shelter. For years, there was debate about whether it should be destroyed. In the end, it was decided to preserve it, more as a symbol of what it once was than as a tribute. Today, it operates as a restaurant and tourist attraction. Thousands of people climb there every summer to see the view, walk the corridors, and take photos where the regime's top brass once met. But beneath the shiny floor and clean walls, there remains the same stone structure that was built in record time, with direct orders, cement brought in by mule and explosives ready in case it needed to be demolished. Murkas' hidden treasure. In early 1945, as the Western Front collapsed and American troops raced across Germany, a group of soldiers arrived in the central German village of Murkas. There, residents reported something strange: truck movements during the night, armed guards, and strict orders not to approach a nearby salt mine. The officers took note and decided to go down to inspect. The entrance was narrow, but the tunnel descended several meters underground. As they advanced, they realized they were no ordinary mining facility. The walls were reinforced, the doors sealed, and at the far end, behind a metal hatch, they found one of the largest finds of the war. Dozens of tons of gold ingots and coins, sacks full of foreign banknotes, suitcases with documents, boxes of rings, watches, and jewelry that had been confiscated in concentration camps. Everything was arranged in rows, packed and classified. There were also works of art, antique furniture, and even archives from the Reich Central Bank. The place had been converted into a kind of treasure chamber. It had been secretly moved there from Berlin when it was already clear that the capital was about to fall. The depth, difficult access, and constant humidity helped to conceal it. The soldiers took inventory. Each piece was recorded, photographed, and removed for safekeeping. In total, more than 100 tons of gold, along with millions in cash and assets, left that mine in protected trucks. For weeks, special teams inspected every corner for more hidden passages or sealed compartments. This find was not only shocking because of its quantity. What was most striking was the type of objects: gold teeth, children's brooches, chains engraved with names. Each of these items spoke of a person from whom everything had been taken. The mine was not just a vault, it was the silent witness to a nationwide looting operation hidden underground as the regime collapsed. Today the site is closed to the public, but images of the find continue to appear in military archives. In those photos, ingots are seen stacked next to helmets, rusted weapons, and portraits with broken frames, all under the same dim gallery light. Issue 6: The Lost Machine of Cellesia. In the region of Lower Silesia, near the border between what is now Poland and the Czech Republic, the Nazis installed one of their strangest and most secret projects. They called it Die Glocke, which in German means the bell. It was an experimental device, cylindrical in shape and with rounded edges, which, according to Allied intelligence reports, was enclosed in an underground structure with limited access and highly specialized personnel. The device was approximately 8 feet tall, had a thick metal casing, and was connected to tubes, generators, and sealed compartments. Inside was a liquid some called Serum 525. Reports described it as shiny, viscous, and dangerous. No one outside the project knew for sure what purpose the device served, but the few documents that were recovered indicate that it was intended to involve propulsion, magnetism, or even gravity manipulation. The project was overseen by engineers from the SS Wunderwaffe program, those responsible for developing weapons that could turn the tide of the war. The testing site is near a structure known as the Henge, a series of concrete pillars arranged in a circle which some link to the Die Glocke testing ground. However, no complete drawings or original photographs of the device in operation have ever been found. What most puzzled Allied investigators was the sudden disappearance of the equipment and the device. At the end of the war, when Soviet troops arrived in the area, they found no trace of the device or the scientists involved. It is presumed that some of the equipment was moved to another location or destroyed to avoid capture. Others believe that those responsible escaped with the help of clandestine networks protecting high-ranking officials of the regime. Die Glocke has been cited numerous times in declassified documents, interviews with former military personnel, and incomplete archives. Although many aspects of its design remain unconfirmed, the project was real, and it is mentioned alongside other experimental weapons of the Third Reich. To this day, the mystery fuels hypotheses about its purpose, but there is not a single verified image of its operation. The site where it once stood remains closed to the public, overgrown with vegetation and protected by fences. All that remains is an empty structure, broken slabs, and a story with no ending, never officially explained by anyone. Number 5. The Amber Room that swallowed the war. For centuries, the Amber Room was one of the world's most impressive decorative spaces. An entire room covered in carved amber panels, gold inlays, and ornate mirrors. It was originally designed in Prussia and later installed in the Catherine Palace outside St. Petersburg. Its orange glow, polished reliefs, and intricate moldings made it a unique work of art, admired by kings, diplomats, and visitors from around the world. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the army advanced rapidly through Russian territory, and one of its cultural targets was precisely that room. Despite attempts to protect, dismantle, or hide it, the Nazis managed to take every piece. They packed the panels, numbered them, and shipped them in crates to Königsberg, in present-day Kaliningrad, where they were installed within the local castle museum. For several years, they were on public display there. But when the war took a turn and the Soviet advance became unstoppable, evacuations began. German officials attempted to move the museum's contents before the bombs hit. However, after the siege and bombing of Königsberg in 1944, the castle was almost completely destroyed. Since then, the Amber Room's whereabouts have disappeared from view. No official record remains of where the crates ended up, nor are there any photographs confirming their condition after the attack. For decades, Russian and German researchers and treasure hunters searched for clues. Some believed it was transported by ship and sank in the Baltic Sea. Others thought it was buried in a mine or bunker that collapsed underground. There were even excavations in Poland and Germany based on rumors and statements from veterans, but none yielded conclusive results. The only thing that remains is a modern reconstruction, installed in the same palace where the original once stood, made from old photographs and similar materials. But the real Amber Room, the one that had spanned centuries and wars, remains missing. It was one of the largest art thefts in history and one of the cultural enigmas left unsolved by the war. Issue 4, the Ree Project's Dead-End Maze. Deep in the mountains of southern Poland, amid dense forests and unmarked dirt roads, the Nazis developed a network of tunnels and underground structures that is still not fully understood today. The project was named Ree, which means giant in German. It wasn't a single site. It was a series of connected facilities excavated from solid rock spread across different parts of the Owl Mountains. Work began in 1943 when the Allied advance on the Eastern Front was already evident. To build it, prisoners from the Gross Rosen concentration camp were employed, working themselves to death inside tunnels filled with dust, humidity, and heavy machinery. Using dynamite, shovels, and jackhammers, they opened passages, reinforced ceilings with steel beams, and created large chambers, many of which had no visible purpose. No one knew exactly what they were for. Some corridors extended hundreds of meters into the mountain. Others ended abruptly in smooth walls. There were sections with rails, areas with concrete platforms, and warehouses where unlabeled materials were stored. Everything was under strict military surveillance. Partial plans, isolated equipment, and orders came directly from the highest offices of the regime. One of the most common theories is that the complex was to serve as an underground headquarters armored against bombing and connected by internal tunnels that would allow troops to be evacuated or mobilized without exposure. Others believed it would house secret weapons factories or even experimental laboratories. The truth is that when the war ended, the project was not finished. When the Soviets arrived, what they found were abandoned corridors, rusted machinery, skeletons in collapsed galleries, and incomplete plans. There were no documents explaining the final purpose. Some areas were sealed, others partially flooded. For years, the tunnels were closed and vegetation gradually covered the tunnels. Entrances. Today, parts of the complex can be visited with a helmet and flashlight, but most remain inaccessible. Some areas may have been blocked by landslides, others were never completed. What remains is an unmarked, echo-filled labyrinth of concrete walls, cable-less cranes, and platforms leading nowhere. It is one of the largest remains of the regime, and at the same time one of the most enigmatic. Number 3. The bunker where it all ended. Just a few meters from the Brandenburg Gate, beneath a simple, unremarkable garden, lay one of the most closely guarded and secret sites of the regime's final years. The Führer bunker was an underground structure designed as a refuge for high-ranking commanders, but it ultimately became the final seat of Nazi power. Built several meters underground, amid layers of reinforced concrete, narrow corridors, and armored doors, it was expanded in stages as the military situation worsened. Access was limited. There was a corridor leading from the Reich Chancellery, metal staircases, pressure chambers, and austere, windowless rooms with thick walls and low ceilings. The closest members of Hitler's inner circle lived there in the final weeks, along with officers, aides, and medical staff. The light was artificial all day. Air filtered through fans, and water came through emergency pipes. There was no signal from the outside, only radios receiving increasingly worse news. From that bunker, Hitler gave his last orders, signed meaningless documents, and received military reports that no longer changed anything. Situation maps hung on one of the main walls. Impromptu meetings were held in a small dining room. The kitchen functioned just fine. The hours passed slowly, between the sound of the bombing heard above and the certainty that the siege was closing. While the city burned, those inside maintained a routine that no longer made sense. Some wrote letters, others burned files. Official documents were destroyed, safes emptied, and measures were taken to prevent any trace from being exposed. In the final days, the atmosphere became denser. No one spoke loudly, no one looked anyone in the eye. They just waited. When the Red Army reached the nearby streets, the entrances were sealed. Above ground, almost nothing remained. The Chancellery building had been reduced to rubble, and underground the bunker was emptied. Some managed to escape through tunnels, others were trapped. The site was inspected days later by Soviet troops. They found empty rooms, used mattresses, food scraps, and scorched sections of the floor. Over the years, the site was covered up, dismantled, and built over. Today there is a dirt park, some discreet signs, and a parking lot. Not a single original wall remains visible. But in that windowless basement, for weeks, the last shred of power of a regime that was already dead held fast. Number 2. The Hidden Workshop of Counterfeit Banknotes. In the most critical years of the war, when the economic and military wear and tear was felt on all fronts, the High Command of the Third Reich launched an operation that did not. It didn't involve tanks or planes, but it was aimed directly at the enemy's financial system. The plan was seemingly simple: flood the United Kingdom with counterfeit pounds sterling to destabilize its economy. They called it Operation Bernhard. To carry it out, they gathered a select group of prisoners inside the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. They weren't soldiers or engineers. They were printers, engravers, typographers, experts in paper money. They were forced to work in closed facilities under constant surveillance with specialized tools. They reproduced the plates, the paper, the serial numbers, and even the typical wear and tear of the banknotes in circulation. For months, they printed counterfeit pounds that were virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. It was meticulous work. Any mistake could betray the entire process. They were checked with magnifying glasses, weighed and compared with authentic copies. When the banknotes were ready, they were put into circulation through intermediaries, clandestine networks, and covert operations outside the country. A significant portion was dropped from airplanes into Allied-controlled areas with the intention of generating confusion and losing confidence in the currency. Another portion was used to finance secret operations, bribery, the purchase of strategic resources, and support for spies in various countries. For a time, the plan worked. Some banks didn't notice the difference. British authorities were slow to recognize the magnitude of the threat. However, when they discovered that the circulation of counterfeit banknotes was skyrocketing, the Bank of England took urgent measures. It changed designs, adjusted printing methods, and launched discreet investigations to prevent panic. At the same time, the Allies, liberating the camps, discovered the counterfeiting facilities and arrested several of the technicians forced to participate. Many of the counterfeit banknotes survived the war. Some were found in safes, others in buried bags, and some were recovered from the bottom of lakes where the Nazis tried to hide evidence before surrendering. To this day, examples remain in museums and private collections. They are silent proof of an unprecedented financial operation designed not to steal but to destroy an economy from within. Number 1. The discovery in Mangalas' basement. In 1944, the trains arriving at Auschwitz unloaded entire groups in a matter of minutes. As soon as they touched the ground, the prisoners were examined by a doctor who quickly decided who was fit for work and who was immediately separated. Among those who remained alive, specific cases began to be separated. If someone was a twin, had a deformity, or was very short, they were removed from the group. These were the ones that interested Josef Mengele, one of the doctors there. He would approach, ask basic questions, ask for names, examine the children, and ask about siblings. If he saw something useful, he would send them to another block. The twins were measured, weighed, had their blood drawn, and compared with each other. They were injected with different liquids, some to provoke reactions, others without explanation. Sometimes substances were applied to their eyes to alter their color. If one of the two died, the other was removed to open it and study the differences. There were children who underwent several surgeries without anesthesia. Everything was recorded on sheets that were kept in folders. When once the procedures were completed, the remains were sent to other locations for further analysis. The goal was not to cure anything. It was simply observation and recording. Those who assisted were also prisoners. Some came from previous medical jobs, others simply did what they were told. They had to record data, help move children, or clean up after themselves. They lived under constant threat. Anyone who failed was replaced without delay. Compared to the rest of the camp, the children selected for testing received more food and slept indoors, but only as long as they remained useful. When they were no longer useful, they were removed from circulation. After their liberation, folders, notebooks, jars of organs, drawings with notes, and photographs of the process were found. There was a notebook with dates, names, and repeated marks that crossed over between different cases. More than 1,000 children ended up in that program. Only a few survived. Many believed they were being treated for something. Josef Mengele escaped as soon as the war ended. He went to South America and was not tried. Years later, human remains were found in Brazil that matched him, but there was no conviction. His name became linked to those experiments because of the materials that turned up at the site. Before the Soviets arrived, camp officials tried to burn or hide whatever they could, but instruments, papers, and jars remained that confirmed everything that had been done. Many of the sites used during the Third Reich were designed to leave no trace. There were no signs, no visible plans, no names written anywhere. They only functioned while they were needed, and then they were covered with earth, covered with wood, or blown up with dynamite. For years, no one knew where they were. Some appeared by accident: a collapsed tunnel beneath a village, a metal box at the bottom of a lake, a field filled with concrete beneath a quiet forest. Others emerged when someone reviewed old papers in a poorly classified archive. None were marked on the maps. None had an official explanation. Each discovery made it clear that there was another structure operating behind the known one, a parallel network with no witnesses, no reports, no limits. And although more than 80 years have passed since the war ended, there are still covered-up places, areas marked as dangerous, locked vaults, and documents that remain trapped in the wrong place, waiting for someone to find them by mistake.